Oh God, as we gather in your name, we're grateful for this opportunity to share this time, these moments together, not just with each other, but with you. And what we pray, Lord, is what we always pray at this time is we want our time of discussion, our time of study to be reflective and to be an applied type of learning so that what ultimately is created is the nature of Christ inside of us. So we give you our minds and our hearts at this time, and we pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so chapter 10, which is the last chapter of good old The Pursuit of God. And just general thoughts. What have you thought of the book? And you're not going to hurt my feeling. Like it, don't like it? So you like it? Okay, good. He has about 1,000 books, so you can just Google up A.W. Tozer and read to your heart's content. If you like The Pursuit of God, I think you're really going to like The Knowledge of the Holy. And The Knowledge of the Holy is one of my favorite books. And there's also a book that's the follow-up to this one called The Pursuit of Man, or The Pursuit of People, Person, Human. And those two books, this book, The Pursuit of God, and The Pursuit of Man, go hand in hand. So if you like this and you want to read the next piece of this, then The Pursuit of Man is the book you want. And then I think this was maybe his fourth book that he wrote, The Knowledge of the Holy. All right, so this one is called The Sacrament of Living, chapter 10. Now, before we get into it, let's go back and look again at chapter 9, or just maybe a little thumbnail summary. The idea in chapter 9 is that Tozer he draws upon the Matthew chapter 11 passage of where Jesus is speaking to people while he's in ministry along the way. Come unto me, all that are weary and heavy laden. The idea of exchanging of yokes. You give me your yoke, your burden. I give you my yoke, my burden. And the context of that is that people, the entrance to Jesus, or this exchange of yokes, is the idea of coming in humility, low of heart, compared to how other people would see themselves. And he talks, that's sort of the motif that he uses in that chapter, trying to explain the whole sanctification process. And he ends chapter 9 with the looking at two main oppositions to this exchange of yoke. One of them is the idea of pride, the overinflated view of a person, how they see themselves. And just by nature, if we overinflate ourselves, then others would be underinflated. I mean, they would be beneath. And then close to pride, and this is the second opposition, is what he calls pretense. And we talked a little bit about that last week, about how people present or present something to the world around them, but on the inside they're more like this. And the idea is more in line, what we want is authenticity, we want honesty. The first step to holiness is honesty. It's just a self-evaluation of who you are, where you are, and how that relates to God. So he continues this thought from chapter 9 into chapter 10 because he begins the chapter with this idea that if peace is the goal, or to use rest from the Matthew chapter 11 passage, part of what the exchange of yoke, what that is that instead of the yoke of the Torah, earning holiness, earning salvation, what Jesus offers is rest, a different type of burden, and the net effect of that is peace, which is something on the inside of a person I mean, there's a couple of different ways that the Bible describes and interprets, defines peace. One is that, the peace as in the opposite of war. Outside circumstances are at peace, they're not fighting. And that's pretty self-explanatory, and you find that often in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, when it talks about peace, it's more of an inward trait or a quality, characteristic of a person, the nature of a person that transcends any situation. And so when Jesus talks about peace, 9 times out of 10, he's not talking about the absence of war as in, two parties fighting against each other, as much as he's describing this inward quality, this inward nature. How are we doing on, I got some people taking coats off, some people doing like this. I mean, I know it. So, so we have coffee over there if you're cold. I just want you to know that's, and ice water if you're hot. So take your pick. So the net effect is peace. So when Tozer begins chapter 10 with the idea of another opposition or impediment to this peace that Christ has offered, offered and continues to offer. And in chapter 10, what Tozer does is the greatest hindrance to this internal, this inward peace is what he calls the practice of dividing our lives between the sacred and the secular. And so all chapter 10 is about this division of life that in his day, now keep in mind this is mid-20th century. I think he wrote this in 1948. I think when this one, Pursuit of God. We would probably say the church, non-church, the flesh, the spirit. You probably have heard language around that, the temporal, the eternal. But it's this idea of how people see life. And what I mean by life is everything that you would, full inclusion of that. Your life, person, what you do, who you are, how is there a division in what's holy, what is not, what's sacred, what is secular, what's of God, of the church, what is not, what is flesh, what is spirit. And Tozer would argue that, at least in his day, and I think it's true in our day as well, I think he's touching on something that is common to both his day and our day, is that we have a tendency to divide our life into two departments. The things that belong to God and the things that don't. Now, if you don't think that's a correct assumption, then obviously chapter 10, you'll come out in a different place. Tozer is assuming that this is an accurate description of humanity, at least in his day and in his culture, and so we're making the same assumption as well. So just like last week, do you think that's a fair assumption in your life or in people's lives or however you want to look at that? That we divide things into the things that belong to God, of God, spiritual, holy, and then the things that aren't. Things that please God. What Tozer would say is that of the things that belong to God, that are sacred, holy, of the Spirit, obviously for the Christian there's great satisfaction in those things. There's assurance with those things. But the non-spiritual, the non-sacred, the secular things, that we sort of just put up with them and they are what they are. He actually lists some of those in the chapter. It says the ordinary activities of life, the eating, the sleeping, the working, the looking after the needs of the body and performing our dull and prosaic duties here on earth, they are the secular things. We do these reluctantly and often have misgivings with them because we do not, at least from the Christian perspective, we don't associate them on the same level as the sacred. And for Tozer, he would say that people who are pursuing God probably are frustrated with these things and long for a better day where they're not bothered by these secular tasks. Again, if you have the assumption that you think he's correct in identifying at least one of the major aspects for how we see and judge society is this divide between these two departments, secular and sacred, then Tozer might be describing you, or might be describing at least society around. He goes on to say that Christians are caught in this trap of the demands and the claims of both worlds. The trap of what it means to live in this sacred world, and then at the same time what it means to live in just the mundane activity of everyday life. If you want some further reading on this, it's either Richard or Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a book, Christ and Culture, and it's sort of a textbook. I mean, it is the heavyweight quintessential book on how does the church historically, church as in big C, judge the culture around them. Is it, do they engage the culture? Do they withdraw from the culture? Do they exist on two different planes? It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend that. But it's like reading a textbook. So, that might or might not strike your fancy. But it at least gives you what either Richard or Reinhold does is, or what they did, I think they're dead now, is they looked at historically how the church has operated, and so it talks about, and then theologically, and it'll pigeonhole certain theologians like Luther, Wesley, Calvin, or what have you, and put them at whatever camp that they're in. And then whatever is your major worldview or your church view, cultural view, will also give insight into why we do what we do, because you have this type of understanding of how Christ interacts with the culture around you. So it's a great book. Maybe in a couple of years we might read that one, huh? If you loved C.S. Lewis, you're going to hate this one, let me tell you. So, anyway, I think he's a Yale or Harvard guy. All right, so any comments or questions around just the assumption that Tozer makes that have to do with this obstacle to this exchange of yokes, to use chapter 9 language, which yields a level of peace inside of the person. And that is, the assumption is that we have a tendency to bifurcate or to divide our life around what is sacred and what is holy. All good still? All right, good deal. So now Tozer, even though he identifies that as an assumption and the fact that we're caught in this trap, what he wants people, or at least what I would argue he wants the reader to conclude, is that it's a false trap, and there's something we can learn from this to where we don't divide our life. That's the goal. Y'all getting cold? All right. No? Well, so if we'll give it another 10 to 20 minutes, and then we'll, all right. So Tozer would say that there's a false trap that we tell ourselves. And he gives some rationale for why, he gives evidence for why he sees this as a false trap. Number one, inside the New Testament, there's not the sacred secular divide. Would you agree from your knowledge of the New Testament? You would agree. Would you be right? We have moved it a half degree, all right? So in your mind, if you're cold, just envision you're sitting on the beach. It's a nice summer day, and you can feel just you can smell the ocean and feel the warm breeze, and oh, so good, right? Tozer would say in the New Testament, sacred, secular divide, he said you can't justify that. Doesn't exist. And I think he's right. He also, another evidence would be that Jesus, again as the model of our faith, didn't have the problem of this divide. He didn't say, this is what I do over here that's earthly or temporal or secular, and this is what I do over here that is holy, sacred, and eternal. With Jesus, all of it is sacred. Everything is eternal. Everything is in that camp, that there's not just a divide.
Would you say that the temptations that Jesus faced were never tempted in the wilderness?
Or what?
To be worldly and to be...
All right, it's a good question, right? So the question is, in the Gospels, primarily the Synoptics, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is in the temptation stories that exist in the very beginning of the Gospels. The temptations, there are three that are named. Now, there are more than three, but three are highlighted. Were they, to some degree, at its nature, a temptation to divide, to see life as worldly compared to it as sacred. The first temptation is he's been fasting for 40 days. Now, whether or not it's a literal 40 or not, we don't know. It's a long time. I mean, have you ever fasted for 40 days? I mean, do you ever fast? None? Okay. Not, yeah, exactly right. So well, hang on now. If you're sick, I can't go on bed. I don't know if that's called that fasting. Fasting is the willingly to give it up, not forced to give up. But the so the discipline of fasting is actually really, I think the world of it. And so what you do is and it could be anything. It could be the news, all right? So, whatever occupies your time, energy, thoughts, whatever it may be, to give that up for something else. Now, you determine what the fast is. Now, historically, it's predominantly food or drink. But if it's a daily activity that you have, and it's important to you, the idea is you want to sacrifice that for something else that is of importance as well. And it's not necessarily what you give up that's important. It's the reason behind that. The giving up of something is that it will remind you why you're doing it, and then to focus on whatever it is that is now of greater importance. In food, for instance, we all eat, and you all eat a few times a day. When you are not eating, you are going to know that you are not eating, and you're going to be hungry. Or if you're not drinking, whatever it may be. So that then says, okay, I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, whatever it may be. I give that up, and I want to focus in, maybe prayer or whatever, on something else. That's the whole purpose of fasting. It is about the most practical discipline, and yet least practice for inside the church. Most people do not fast, and yet, it's one of the, inside Judaism, it's one of the three major pillars of spirituality, and even in other world religions. Protestants don't fast as much as, mainly because that's one of the divides that takes place in the Protestant Reformation. Catholics fast weekly, daily. Once a week, which is why when you went to school, public or private, I don't know about in private, but in public school, what did you eat on Friday? Why? No meat. Where do you think that comes from? It came. Yeah. And the reason why is because Catholics don't eat meat on Friday. It's a fast, so you eat fish, and so that's where it comes from. But anyway, I don't know how we got on that. Who brought up fasting? So I know it. So, right. Sure, sure. Right. So the question was, are the temptations of Jesus, is that to divide between sacred and not? And because the assumption is part of the human condition is for us to want to divide, and I think that's a fair assessment.
I have a really big coat that
Yeah, sure. The temperature's set on 70, so I mean, I just want you to know. I mean, it's 70 degrees in this room, and so just and the range is 69 to 75, and so we bumped it up, so it'll probably go to 71, and it has it can move 2 to 4 degrees, so we'll see how it goes. All right. So I think that's a fair assessment. I do think that in a fair assumption. What she said was that the temptations of Jesus early in the Gospels, was it to create a divide between what is sacred and what is not? The first temptation, I think definitely is turn the stone into bread. The other two, I'm not sure. But there is inside of humanity the desire to separate between sacred and secular. Because why do you think we want to do that? Now, all right, so we got an answer that says to be in control. Tozer does not give us the answer why, but I'm just curious. Why do you think that we have a tendency to want to separate? All right, so to be in control, or that if just a limited amount is in the sacred camp, then that's all we have to worry about, and we get a free pass on what's in the secular. Is that close? You said it'd be more fun. So, well, no, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I mean, I'm just looking at the rationale why we do like to separate.
it is like a hard jump from being, like you kind of grow up being like, I'm a Christian.
Right.
It's a hard jump to be like, I'm going to be Christ-like all the time. I'm going to be,
Right. So the burden of everything being sacred, who wants that? I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And so it's sort of like if we're at work 24/7, then we might lead to burnout. So maybe a Sabbath to the sacred is the secular. How about that? Maybe. But I think that's all. I think that's all right.
A lot of people have a different day than a Sabbath, but they use that day as a special day to take the pressure off of them.
Right. Yeah. So this idea of having not having the pressure of okay. So let's stay with this for a second. So maybe one of the reasons why we have this divide is because we think living in the sacred just requires so much that the pressure of that, just naturally we don't want to live with that level of pressure. You think that's maybe some of it? I mean, for instance, now you hear, right? So you hear preachers say this, live your life. What was the little bracelets? WWJD. What would Jesus do? The idea is everywhere I go and everything that I do, Jesus is with me, right? You see the little Jesus is my co-pilot. And all, y'all probably might. Hope no one has. Do y'all have that on your car? Right, so I love it. I mean, So, but the idea is that everywhere I go, there Jesus is with me. On some level, who wants that? Right? We want it, but at the same time, gosh, if Jesus is with me every single minute of the day, that's a lot of pressure. Sure. Yeah, the hope. The key word there is we hope that's what it is, that our faith is comforting and not convicting. Here's how I hear it. Shane or John shows up someplace, and I'm being sarcastic, but someone will say, "Oh, the preacher's here. We got to be good." I mean, it's like that. Oh, and then and then Jesus trumps the preacher. So here Jesus is. Oh man, this is everything's got to be holy. And organ music all the time, and but so there's a level of pressure, I think, for some people because over here is high and lifted up, and who wants to live with that level of pressure all the time? Now I think that's one of the some of the rationale that fuels this divide that we sort of adopt. Whether it's right or wrong, I'm not trying to answer that, but
Maybe an anxiety about being perfect.
well, it could be. All right, particularly if you go back to chapter 9 with the idea of, remember, what's one of the struggles, what's one of the obstacles to this exchange of yoke? That's a pretense. Right. So I mean, the idea of that constantly under the watch care of this all-seeing God. That just sounds frightening, doesn't it? And particularly if you have a view of God, you know what the largest, just on the masses. Now I'm not talking. Oops, excuse me. Some in the church, some not. But just if you ask people what their view, what do they think God is thinking of them? Okay. Do you know what the number one answer is? Disapprove. God is angry with me. That is the overarching view of just the masses. Now, I'm not saying it's the answer in this type of this room, but if you just ask the everyday person of people who acknowledge that God does exist, what do you think God is thinking of you? It is, I don't even want to begin to imagine. So if you have that thought, and that's Barna, okay, it's Barna Institute, it's not Shane. If you have that thought that that's how God sees people, sees humanity, then this pressure of living in everything being sacred is man, I don't want that. Because if God is, if His first thought is disapproval of me, then, if over here, if I can manage that, control that, and do that in a way that at least is pleasing to some degree, and over here, maybe I just want a break, a Sabbath, a day off, or a free pass. Yeah, maybe.
James, when we were younger, after you get in the Army, we went to many cocktail parties.
Right.
Nobody stood around talking about, did you go to church this week, or how, that just wasn't mentioned, so consequently, I didn't mention it.
Sure.
So I think sometimes it's just pressure.
Right. Oh, yeah. So,
And
yeah.
we couldn't just say, no, we're not going because you all don't talk about it.
Right. Well, or how about church clothes, play clothes?
Exactly.
Remember that?
Exactly.
So yeah, and all this I think goes into this whole divide that we have. So I think the assumption is correct from Tozer, and but it's a false assumption. It's assumption that is not accurate. One, to the New Testament, it's not accurate to Jesus, at least what was modeled in his life. And then he also mentions in the chapter, it's not accurate to part of this 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So I gave you, and that's going to be the passage that he sort of uses as his main text to some degree for. And 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, let me give you just a thumbnail sketch of 1 Corinthians in the background. Paul started the church in Corinth. He left after some time. The church falls apart. There are all these factions vying for power, and at the same time, Corinth would be, I'm trying to think what would be the equivalent. Maybe Nashville, Austin, Texas would be a good example of a city that is growing, is growing faster than the average. It's, hub technology, things like that. Corinth went from small town to international city overnight, and partly because they were able to capitalize on the shipping industry, which was the main. They have planes or trains or things like that. So if you want to move goods, you used ships. Because going around the peninsula was so dangerous, they had this monopoly on where ships would come into one port, offload their goods, and then they only had to take them about, I think it's about 4 miles, and then they could put them back on another boat. And so they owned both ports. And so the city grew to both ports, if you can imagine the geographical sites there. And so in any time there's a fast-growing city, whether it be in the ancient world or in today's world, there's all kind of wonderful things that can come with that. There's jobs, there's industry, there's arts, all those things. And there's the part of society that we don't like. And that grew as well. And particularly around, they had a huge sex industry in Corinth. And so people were coming in from all over the Roman Empire to this city. So with that, they brought all their histories, all their religions, all their cultures, and so all that was put in the melting pot for Corinth. So with that context and the fact that the church is just struggling, they sent a handful of folks to track Paul down, and they had a list of questions. You know, we need your help. Weigh in on this because we're struggling. And so Corinth, the structure of the book of Corinthians is nothing more than just question 1, then here's the answer. Question 2, here's the answer, and on down the line. When you get to chapters 10, and it may be a chapter before, and into a little bit of chapter 11, I think, what you're dealing with is the issue around food and sex and how that deals in worship and with idols. Do what? It may be. So, but the around chapter 10, it's the issues around food, and particularly food that's offered to idols. What is that like? What do we do? What do we not do? Do we participate? Do we not participate? And so Paul is addressing that. On some level, what I've 14 through 22 deals specifically with things that are in Paul's day. And the idea would be is if you take food and you offer it to God, and then your neighbor takes food and offers it to something else, and then y'all have a block party, what do you do? Or more specifically, say you've got friends who are not Christian, and they invite you to participate in some pagan worship that has food, what do you do? And so he's picking up on some of the stuff that's going on that's specific to that day. Particularly meat that is offered in sacrifices. The way you would do it, you'd go down to your local priest. You would bring some level of meat. They would take a third of that. They would put it on the altar, burn it up. That was an offering to God. A third of the meat stayed with the priest, and then a third of the meat went home with you for whatever it is you were going to do with it. And if it was going to be a home sacrifice, then Paul's saying that's what he writes about in 4 through 22. Also in the Greek world, you need to know a little bit about the Greek world. Greek world saw the world as heavens above, earth in the middle, and then hell or Hades, all that stuff is below the earth. So they saw it sort of linear. And what the middle area, which was earth, where humans live, they saw the divines, both from the underworld and from Olympus, as having access to earth all the time. So if you go back and read your Greek mythologies and things like that, you see that type of interaction. Go watch Greek movies. You see how gods, both good and bad, interact. And deity by nature was indifferent towards humanity. They really didn't care. They were just pawns to be used. So that's the worldview of secular and spiritual together. They also thought that demons were everywhere. I mean, just because you got this interaction. So a little of what you find when Paul is addressing the Corinth community in chapter 10 is specifically around these sacrifice, like home sacrifices, and this idea of Greek world and how they saw deity behind everything, good or bad. And then the idea of what do we do when we take communion? This is the table of Christ. And do we take, like say if you have a sacrifice at home where all your Christian friends and y'all take communion, because it's not like communion the way we do it today. They didn't build churches to the 350s. Communion services in worship in the early church was more like Wednesday night supper, potlucks. I'm serious. That's what, so what they would do is everybody bring food, they'd eat, and at some point someone would talk about the acts of Christ, and that would, then they would take bread, and then they would take wine, and they would set that specifically aside as in remembrance of upper room. But it was more around a big supper than it would be at the end of a worship service or in the middle of a worship service or the beginning of a worship service. But in that day, if you have your potluck supper and you take the consecrated elements over to your neighbor's house and they have their consecrated meal, do you just swap? Do you kind of, and Paul's like, no, we might, So 4 through 22 deal with specific issues in Paul's day. All right? Tozer picks up on verse 31 where Paul is leaving the specific and he's moving to something more universal, just as, let me help you in your daily life when it comes to food or drink. Is it spiritual? Is it not spiritual? And what Paul is saying is that, one, if you get invited to your neighbor's house and they didn't tell you it's going to be a consecrated event, but they're just throwing a party because their son or daughter is graduating from the local university and they might or might not be Christian, do you eat the meat anyway? And the general universal rule is, well, just don't ask them. Don't ask them if they went down to the local pagan store and bought the meat and then consecrated it to whatever, the god of education and, for whatever school. And by the way, some of y'all didn't do the right sacrifice because you lost on Saturday. But we'll leave that one for next lesson. That's my only blurb, and then that's it. All right, so I was pulling for you too, let me tell you. I was the only one in the Green household who had Georgia. And the 2 times I pulled for Georgia this year, you lost. So you can blame me. I had you against LSU, and I had you against Alabama. And it's unfortunate you're not one of the 4 because I think you would have a chance of winning it all. All right, so there, I'm playing nice. All right, so, but the first rule is just don't ask. Just eat whatever it is. Give thanks to God for it. The second one, if out of hospitality to your neighbor, just eat whatever's offered to you. Particularly if you don't know it, just give thanks to God and go on with it. And because the universal truth is that it's just food or it's just drink. And so it really doesn't matter. I mean, there's nothing inside of it that's sacred or secular. It's just neutral, morally neutral. So, but if it's going to cause your friend or your brother or your sister to stumble out of their conscience, you acquiesce. Does that make sense? Paul is saying this is all 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Yeah, this has nothing to do with Tozer. Tozer just picks up on verse 31 where, to do everything to the glory of God. Now, what typical Tozer, he takes a half verse and quotes it. The verse, who's got your Bibles? Turn to, it might be on I gave you all a sheet, right? Yeah, what's verse 31 say?
So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God.
Right, so here it is. This is the verse. Is it showing? Yeah, all right, perfect. Tozer only used half the verse. All right. Tozer just said do it all to the glory of God. But the context is that when it comes to eating or drinking, whatever you do, just do it to the glory of God. Because the object is morally neutral. I mean, it doesn't matter. We good? Have faces that look kind of good, kind of not. So, all right. So inside what Tozer is getting at with this idea of secular versus sacred, and the reason why that's a false trap, we do this with food, we do this with drink, it doesn't matter. It's morally neutral. It's what you bring to it that's most important. And on top of that, and this is the fourth, now we're going back to the text. Remember, the reason why Tozer says it's a false trap, one is you can't find the sacred, secular divide in the New Testament. Jesus does not treat life that way. He picks up on this verse to do all to the glory of God. Paul says, everything can be spiritual. Don't worry about it. It's just common items. What makes it sacred is just that God is a part of it. And then the last one is that God has created our bodies. And so the things that we use to fuel our bodies, to feed our bodies, how would that be offensive to God if He's created us that way? You with me? All right. So that's a good break. So let's stop for a second, because then we're going to pick up when we come back on what about the activities where we perverse God. There we go. It's ringing now. Maybe, kind of. All righty. Let's come on back. We will leave 1 Corinthians. All righty. Yeah, I think the prayer request list is going out. All right, so Tozer. So we're back with this sacred secular divide, and Tozer says that's a false trap that we enter into, mainly because you can't find it in the New Testament, and we're not back yet. There we go. It's working now. All right, so we're in this false trap of secular sacred divide. He gives 4 reasons why that's a false trap. It's not in the New Testament. Can't see it in the life of Jesus. Paul's writings of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 do all things to the glory of God, which then opens up before us the possibility that every act of our life in some form or fashion contributes to the glory of God. Common items that are like eating and drinking, the fact that we're doing them for the glory of God turns them into sacred, if you'll grant that language. And then the last reason is that God has created our bodies, so the things we do with our bodies that are just natural, why would that not be pleasing to God if God created us that way? My page 112, which means your page maybe 96, says, why would God be ashamed of His work of His own hands? And Tozer's talking about just us living out our natural life. But Tozer raises a good question, which would be, what about then sinful activity? Can we perverse what is sacred? And when we misuse something that God has deemed to be sacred? And the answer to that obviously is yes, you can. But for the work of the chapter, for Tozer, he assumes that natural living of life, that we're not perverting it and we're not abusing it. My page 113, which would be, I think, your page 97, maybe 96. Every act of his life is, and that could be a person, so his or her life is or can be truly sacred as prayer or baptism or the Lord's Supper. To say this is not is to bring all acts down to one dead level. It is rather to lift every act up into a living kingdom and turn the whole life into a sacrament. If a sacrament is an external expression of an inward grace, then we need not hesitate to accept the above thesis. By one act of consecration of our total selves to God, we can make every subsequent act express that consecration. I think that's a great line, or a great quote. Oh, it's on page 105. So what did I say? Well, I was a math major for a while. Obviously, the basic subtraction I cannot do anymore. So what page was it, 105? 105. So I think this is a really, I think this is profound what Tozer is doing. When we try to divide our life into sacred and secular, what we do then is we bring down every act as if it's not important. But if we can learn to live with it, everything sits under God, so everything we do, and we're not talking about abusing or perversion, but just in our daily life, if we see all of our life as something that is a part of God, something that gives glory to God, then actually what we do is we raise every act to something that of sacrament. Stay with me. All right, all right, sacrament in the understanding of it's an inward grace. I'm not trying to say it's a holy mystery for what we do in our sacraments. Sacramental, incarnational. Maybe those are better words if we don't like the word sacrament. But the idea is that if a sacramental life is an expression of an inward grace that we have in Christ, then why not everything we do, how is that not sacred? Oh, this one is not in the notes. So let me think about what I just said. If our life is sacramental, which means inward grace, an outward appearance of an inward grace, all right? If you're a Christian, you have inward grace. It's the Holy Spirit living in you. So then everything you do is an outward appearance of what it's like to live with this inward grace. So your life then and everything that you do, not just the things you do inside this building or do in ministry or in the church or whatever, everything then is holy. Because it's an outward sign of the inward grace that's a part of you. So even the mundane or the everyday is spiritual. That really wasn't it, Patty, but I'm trying to at least... if you go on the video at 11:02, I promise you can see it. Or actually there's a time delay, so if you run outside real quick, you probably can see it. That was the weirdest thing. Yes?
Would that be like you're out gardening?
Sure. Right. So the thought is you're gardening, and all of a sudden that becomes a means by which to ponder and commune and to reflect on the beauty of creation at the hands of God. Yeah, that'd be a perfect example. So even something as if you want to call gardening mundane, something as mundane as gardening becomes then something that is spiritual. I think Tozer is 100% right here. And I think a good work that we could all do is to see every aspect of our life as something that is spiritual. Right. I mean, I've long been in this camp before I even was introduced to Tozer. Brother Lawrence. I don't know if you know Brother Lawrence or not. He has a book, I think it's called Practicing the Presence of God. It's fantastic. He only wrote one book. And he wanted more than anything else to be a monk. And he was turned down all the time. I mean, dead serious. And every time he would go and beg and beg and beg, they would say, no, 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 no. And so his job in the monastery was to feed the monks. All right? And, at first he hated it because he thought it was beneath him because he really wanted to aspire to be a monk, right? And but he finally came to the conclusion that in the cooking of the food and the washing of the pots and pans, it was spiritual. And so then he didn't want to be a monk anymore. Even when they wanted him to be a monk, he didn't want to be it. Because he realized that he was communing with God in the kitchen. More so than in prayer, more so than in fasting, more so than in the chanting, or more so in the work of what the monks were doing. For him, everything became spiritual. And everything that he did, he practiced the presence of God, whether it was something that was official, part of the monastery, part of the church, or whether it was not. I think there's, when you look at now we can pick up some New Testament writings that I think would acknowledge this. Salt and light. All right, so you got the Beatitudes. Remember that? Matthew chapter 5. And then as soon as you leave the Beatitudes, you get into where Jesus transitions in the sermon around the idea of salt and light as images for what it's like for people who live with beatitude traits and how that get illustrated out into the world in their everyday living. They become like salt and light. So one of the things I will ask of you, the task before us, is that if we live with this divide, it is to begin sort of a new thought that everything you do, whether you think it is or not, at least in the beginning, imagine that it is sacred. So what is just as sacred as coming and studying here in this Bible study is when you leave here and you go eat lunch. Or when you go home and do whatever it is, take a nap, relax, go for a walk, whatever it is that you do. All of it is sacred. Because everything you do, let's think of it this way. Now, Tozer doesn't get onto this, but I'm a huge believer in this. Tell me where you're separated from Jesus. Give me examples in your life where you're separated from Jesus.
When you feel resentful about something you have to do that you don't want to do.
All right, so when you feel resentful, all right, that is a perception. It is not an accurate perception that you're actually separated from Jesus. Which means then, so whenever you feel resentful about something that you do, does that break your relationship with Jesus? That's what I'm after. Yeah, it feels like it. No, I got it. Listen, I'm there. Listen, I'm familiar with what it feels like to be. Oh gosh, man, I'm a heel. I know what that feels like, right? So, but just because you feel that or think that doesn't make it true. As in, there actually is a divide. It is a true feeling. It is a true thought. It is just not an accurate thought of what you think the conclusion is. That's exactly right. There's never a divide. You get an A for today. Thank you. All right? So, it's never a divide. Well, you can live as if there is a divide, but there's never a divide. Because God's goodness is better than your badness. You're justified. Sure. That's right. So justification, all right, keep in mind, Tozer is assuming throughout this whole book justification, which means that even though you don't deserve it, or I deserve it, you are justified. The status before God has changed. Not because you earned it, deserved it. It's just an act of God's grace because of Jesus Christ. Which means then, the connection between you and Jesus, it's restored. That's what justification is. And it's something that God does, all right? So God does this, all right? This is all 100% God. Now, sanctification is living in this relationship. And it's process-oriented. It's fluid, which means there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be movement to it. There's going to be times where it's easy. There are going to be times when it's not. But just because it's in these down times, right here, doesn't mean that this is still not restored. So we might perceive ourselves or feel like, or whatever it may be, that there is separation. Just because we feel that doesn't mean that it's that it's accurate, that it's true. Case in point, how many times, maybe with children, spouse, friends, whatever, have you ever been in a fight with someone that you're in a relationship with? None here. So I do want to welcome you to this Bible study. We have about 10 or 11 minutes. If you're at home and you're watching, I do want you to reflect about the times where you have been in an argument. We cannot relate to that in this classroom. But, all right, so inside a relationship, there are going to be times, well, so say, all right, someone said a sister, all right, you have a fight with your sister. Do you stop being sisters? Why not? You might perceive, you might think, but you're not stop being sisters. Same concept. Right. So, you can live as if there is no connection, right? That happens all the time. And when you do something to what Tozer in the book calls abuse or perversion, all that is, I know perversion in that day is not the same as perversion in our day, so we don't like that word. So we'll just use classical language. When you sin, you live as if there is no connection. All right? But Either God forgives or God does not. It's not like there's this limbo. Maybe He might forgive, if you came to church more, or if you prayed more, or if you served more, gave more, loved more. When that happens, we're going back to chapter 9. You remember that? The yoke of righteousness, right? I got to earn it. If I can fully do all the laws, then I get the wisdom of God. If I get the wisdom of God, then I'm in the good place, right? So we're on chapter 10. That's right. Yeah, it's his steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. Yeah. Now some of the bumps are hard. Yeah. So, but right. So, what would it be like for us? What would it be like for us? Is from this moment forward, we wanted to live as if everything is sacred because we are connected to Jesus. Not because there's pressure. The pressure's already been taken care of. See, if you think chapter 9, if you live in chapter 9, this yoke, remember what chapter 9 is. Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden. You come to me, low of heart, relationship is restored. I give you my burden, which is my nature, which leads to peace. Not, you got to go and do a gazillion things right, and only when you've done them all, then you get over here. The whole wonder of Jesus is that Jesus, His righteousness is what you get via faith. Romans chapter 1, verses 17, 18, 16, 17, somewhere in that neighborhood. The righteousness of God is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So, because this can never be separated, that relationship, because God does this, right? Not because of something we do. This is all the work of God. We're just receivers.
What if you knowingly sin?
Well, everybody knowingly sins. So sins of commission. Yeah, all right, so not sins of omission, which is I want to be helpful and I do something and it actually is hurtful. All right, so, I just don't know. All right, so sins of commission, covered under the cross. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's covered under the cross. Mm-hmm. It's covered. The good news is there's forgiveness. The good news there's forgiveness. Because what will the work of the Spirit is to continually convict, work, uphold, hold accountable, to eventually you don't. But some things aren't fully redeemed this side of death. I'm serious on that. Now it took me. I wasn't always in that camp. And I'm a event. All right, so some things aren't fully redeemed this side of death. For instance, there are some people who things happen to them early on, and it changes their brain chemistry. It changes the. Don't take my word for it. Do the science. And so if someone starts behind the starting line 50 yards, and they never, say in their sanctification process, they go from a -50 to a -5, all we see is that they're still behind the starting line. Some things just won't get redeemed fully to where, but here's the good thing. What does the New Testament talk about in the culmination of the return of Christ? It talks about everything being redeemed. Right, yeah. New heaven, new earth, people. Everything's redeemed. So, God, and that's, so don't feel, I hope you don't feel negatively about that. I mean, so what happens if someone goes through horrible divorce, or they lose a loved one, or someone abuses them? I mean, and compared to someone who doesn't, all right, who doesn't have those same experiences. So, I mean, it's harder for them because what has happened. Are people who are involved in addictions? I mean, it changes your brain. It does. And so it might not be that fully gets redeemed, as in full. Now, redeemed, yes, let me change that word. Fully whole. I mean, it's a wholeness, all right? That's what salvation really means, is wholeness. So when I mean redeemed, I don't mean like God has only redeemed like 80% of it, and then there's, 20%. I mean, no, everything's redeemed, all right? It just might not have the fullness of that until after death. I mean, that's what happens to your body, right? Your body decays. Sure, yeah, or restored's a better word. Yeah, I'm fine with that, okay? I mean, our bodies are decaying, right? I mean, you might not believe that, but it is, So, I mean, it's fast, yeah. Cannot do what you used to, once could, right? So what happens in, what the New Testament talks about when it comes to, fully restored, it uses the idea of new body, right? Well, why? Because the old one is not fully restored, right? So, I mean, there are just some things that I can give you biblical evidence of this, and I can give you theological writings on it. But early on in my ministry, I did not think that was true. I thought if you couldn't see it, it wasn't, it hadn't happened yet. And then, I hope I've gotten wiser and more mature. There are just some things, the effects of people's actions can be so destructive. It just takes a while. And some people, they don't live long enough.
A good example would be like when a believer commits suicide.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect example. There are others. I mean, the idea of we just don't know, and you just don't know the work of God. But if this is, if this is true, then there's nothing that is beyond that relationship. There's nothing that's beyond that connection. Now, we might do things that put us in an environment where we're living beneath this, or where we're living as if, and there are real effects to that, okay? I mean, there are relationships that can be, someone said sisters. I mean, you can get to where the sisters aren't talking, or the brothers aren't talking, or family members aren't talking, and they live as if there is no connection. But just because they're living as if there is no connection, at least when it comes to God, the connection is there. That is the wonder and the power of Jesus, not because inside of us. So give thanks to God. I mean, all of us, should be on our knees with just the level of, oh my, thank you, Lord. Because left unto our own doings, we would mess it up. But you have done something that has prevented. Your goodness is better than our badness. I mean, that's a wonder. And that's the beauty of God's grace and mercy. I'm convinced we have it's going to sound worse than what it is. We just don't have an understanding of grace. I mean, we don't. I mean, most of our grace, we think it comes, it's, someone buys us a present, we have to buy them one. I mean, that's the way we live. Thank you, God, and I'll pay you back. The rest of my life, I'll earn, I'll pray more, I'll love, no. We don't understand it. I mean, the Romans passage, anybody can die for someone they love who's good. What about someone who dies for people that are horrible? Then you get an idea. At least you can wrap your mind around that. That's what Romans says, right? So, so the idea of seeing our life as this bifurcated life between what is sacred and what is secular. Now, Tozer says, if you're right there, if that's home cooking for you, then begin begin with at least the thought, the idea, pray about it, that God, everything is sacred. Everything is holy because you're a part of it. And it's not that we make it holy. The fact that you are part of who we are, then everything that we touch, then you touch. Every place I go, you go. So everything's sacred. Now, he does acknowledge there's some things that have greater responsibility. There's some things that have greater consequences. So obviously, we treat them as such. But it's not that there's a division. Everything's sacred. To use the Psalm language, was it Psalm 139 maybe? Where can you go that you leave God? What mountain? What depth of the sea? What part to the east or to the west? Where do you go that He's not there? This is what the psalmist. I can't. So everywhere I go, there you are too. Sacred. Now, if that's the case, then start to, little by little, envisioning your life this way. Every place I go with Jesus. That's not a bad thing. Right? And so even when you get it wrong, it's all right. He's still with me. He hadn't given up hope yet. Just to envision. Now, to Tozer's point, when we do that, I would imagine that these experiences become less. At least the parts that you can control. All right? So that's the pursuit of God. All right? Any questions, comments, concerns? Yeah, Kathy, I've got some up here. We'll start this next week. And so, yeah, that's what we'll do. All right? Go in peace. Yep.